Interest groups. We're going to cover two of the linkage institutions on this one. Interest groups. Interest groups, special interest groups include lobbyists and political action committees, and they are one of the most criticized components of the political process. An interest group is a public or private group, organization, affiliation, or committee that has its goal the dissemination of its members' viewpoint, and I think more important for government, it's focused on affecting policy, but not all policies, just some policies. So the formation of special interest groups, a common interest, a formal organization is created. So there has to be some sort of common interest that a number of people have to be able to form an organization. The goals will be defined. Lobbyists will be hired. And political action committees are formed. And they attempt to influence legislators. How do they do that? Through campaign donations and through lobbying. Why are interest groups so common in the United States? The more cleavages or differences along religious, cultural, and regional lines in society, the greater the variety of interests that will exist. American constitutional systems allow for a federal decentralized system which creates multiple points for groups to access the government. And because political parties are weak in our system, interest groups have gained strength. So, why are there so many interest groups? Because there's so many differences. And another reason why is because it's possible for interest groups to affect policy because there's so many entry points. They can go to local government, they can go to state government, and they can go to federal government. And when we say just state government and federal government, it's not that simple because they can go to the courts, they can go to the executive branch, they can go to the legislative branch. So there are multiple points of access. Two kinds of interest groups. Institutional interest groups, organizations that represent other organizations. Lawyers and public relation firms represent interests of companies in Washington, like General Motors, the Chamber of Commerce, things like that. And membership groups, groups supported by activities and contributions of individuals. The Sierra Club, which is about environmentalism. And the NAACP, or as this has it, NCAAP, which would be an entirely different group. But the NAACP, which is about civil rights. Incentives to join interest groups. Why join an interest group? It could be for solidary purposes, a sense of status, pleasure, or companionship that arises out of meeting together in small groups. Face-to-face contact is important. So they organize the small local groups, the League of Women Voters, the Parent-Teacher Association, PTA, Rotary Club. Material incentives to receive money or other valued group or service from membership. The AARP supplies low-cost insurance, discount drugs, travel. Purposive, the appeal of stated goals to recruit members. Maybe you really agree with what the interest group stands for. So you really want to push what they are about and support it. How interest groups raise funds. 3 sources of funds. Foundation grants. The Environmental Defense Fund supported almost entirely by grants from foundations like the Rockefeller Family Fund. Federal grants and contracts. But cutbacks in the 1980s have hurt interest groups. Direct mail, letters to targeted recipients to get the targeted recipients to give them money. The activities of interest groups. Information. Their most important power of influence over officials is to give them detailed information. And this is most valuable when the issue is narrow or complex. So if it's an issue that doesn't have a whole lot of broad repercussions. If it has to do with something that only a few people would be interested in, is very clear cut, they can provide information on that. Or if it's something that's so complex it's difficult to understand. Because one thing we have to recognize is that when we elect a representative or a senator, it doesn't make them an expert automatically in everything. So they look for advice and information from people who are supposed to be experts. Public support. Grassroots lobbying aimed at generating public pressure. Politicians tried to avoid controversy, so you can target legislators with whom you agree or disagree for either a benefit or a punishment. So sometimes interest groups will have lists of politicians who are enemies of theirs as far as their political goals, or they may have a rank that they score people. The NRA keeps a scorecard on how supportive legislators are on gun rights issues. Money and PACs. Money is one of the least effective ways interest groups advance their causes because of regulations, and ideological PACs consume almost all of their money raised with massive direct mail solicitations. However, it has been shown through studies that there's a very strong likelihood that the money gives them access. It allows them to get an opportunity to send their lobbyists in to make persuasive arguments. An issue with interest groups is the revolving door. Federal government officials who take jobs in private industry or as representatives, as lobbyists for interest groups. So one of the concerns people have is the idea of people getting elected office or appointed office in federal government becoming very chummy, cozy with people outside of government, knowing that when they get out of government they'll get a sweet job with those individuals. And this isn't just about interest groups. It goes beyond that. Ronald Reagan was criticized by some for making huge money on speeches, getting paid really, really big dollars to make speeches in Japan, after he had, as president, had lots of pro-Japanese business decisions. Causing trouble. Disruptive tactics like protest marches and picketing, so they can do demonstrations. How the government regulates interest groups. Oh, there's one thing else before we go on. I want to say another way interest groups can affect policy is lawsuits. They can go through the court system. All right, so how the government regulates interest groups. Federal lobbying laws. You must register as a lobbyist. You have to name your clients, your income, expenditures, and issues on which you work. This doesn't really apply to grassroots groups. It applies mainly to institutional groups. The tax code and campaign finance laws. If the organization does serious lobbying, it will lose its tax-exempt status. So now we'll move on to the media. That's a really short one on interest groups. The media. All right, so bad news about presidential candidates increases. So one of the first things we're going to talk about is the negative reporting on presidents. And if you look at the trend here, you see on this chart the darker color. I don't know how this is going to end up looking on YouTube. And the lighter color, the darker color is good news, the lighter color is bad news. And if you'll notice, by 1980, we suddenly have more bad news reporting. Then it shifts back in 1984. And by 1988 on, it looks like bad news is more often reported than good news about presidential candidates. The 4 periods of journalistic history in the United States. The party press. In the early years of the Republic, newspapers were subsidized, paid for by political parties. Only a small elite group read them, and they were incredibly partisan. The popular press. Because of changes in society and technology, the high-speed rotary press made printing cheap enough so that you could have self-supporting mass readership daily papers that would use advertisements to fund themselves. Publishers could become powerful political forces. This is sometimes associated with yellow journalism, this period of time. Magazines of opinion. Middle-class reactions to yellow journalism led to less sensationalism and more non-political coverage, and more news magazines were popping up. Think Time and Newsweek, but before Time and Newsweek were around, there were others, Harper's and so on. Electronic journalism. Radio and television allows for direct politician-to-voter links. It creates the soundbite issue, and one of the issues with it is selective viewing, which is people tune out the people that they don't agree with. So if you're conservative, you listen to Fox News all the time. If you're liberal, you go to MSNBC all the time. I suggest if you're going to be smart, you move around a little bit. Don't watch the same news channel all the time. You know, if you like one a lot, go watch the one you don't like a lot once in a while at least, and try to get some balance as far as what's being told to you. Because I'm going to let you know, both sides have an agenda and they distort things. So radio comes along in the 1920s in significant numbers, and television shows up in the 1940s and becomes significant in the 50s. Influence on politics that the national media can have. It can be a gatekeeper. It can influence what becomes an issue and for how long. Examples are crime and Vietnam. They usually don't decide our opinions for us. Usually what they do is bring up things for us to think about. Scorekeeper. They can make or break a politician's reputation. Carter, Gary Hart, George, they give examples here that may or may not mean anything to you. Carter, for example, in an interview talked about the state of melancholy in America. He mentioned in a famous interview that one of his sins was he lusted after other women beside his wife. He didn't actually cheat on her, but just being straight up open about what his mental sins caused him problems with some people. Gary Hart got caught having an affair. Although scorekeeper to me really implies they're using the horse race politics where they're comparing who's in the lead and who's behind and talking about momentum all the time. Watchdog, they can examine political and personal lives. Again, the Gary Hart scandal, the Bill Clinton scandal, the Gary Condit scandal. You may not be familiar with that one. We're not going to go into that too much. You can look at the Benghazi situation as a watchdog situation. The Republican congressman who has been on the news for kissing someone who worked for him rather intimately rather than kissing his wife. Regulation of the content of television and radio. The equal time rule. If a station sells time to one candidate, it has to be willing to sell equal time to an opposing candidate. That's not really in place anymore because of cable and internet and all this kind of stuff. The argument that was made is that this is not necessary anymore because there's so many ways to get your message out. The right to reply rule, again, another thing. If a person is attacked on a broadcast other than in a regular news program, that person has the right to reply over the same station. This is not particularly enforced either. Political editorializing rule. If a broadcaster endorses a candidate, the opposing candidate has the right to reply. Remember, anything you're not really familiar with, go look it up. You've got a book. You've got notes. Use them. Routine selected and insider stories. Routine. Routine stories are public events regularly covered by reporters. They're comparatively free of bias. Selected stories. Public events knowable to inquiring reporters but not usually reported. The bias of the reporter or editor may figure prominently in the selection. Insider stories, events not usually public, revealed because someone inside reveals them. The problem of the motive of the leaker is present. Who's leaking it? Why are they leaking it? Are they telling the truth? Those kinds of issues. And that goes into something about news all the time, which is you have to determine not only the honesty of the source of the reporting, but also the credibility of where they're getting their information from. And news reporters sometimes get fooled. The impact of the media on politics. Studies of media impact on elections are generally inconclusive. Local newspapers often endorse Republican candidates. Why? Because most newspapers are owned by businesses, and businesses tend to favor Republican candidates. National conventions are scheduled to accommodate television. Candidates win their party nomination through media exposure, so media definitely has a role. Television influences the political agenda. In other words, not what we think, but what we think about. Issues that the television news stations report a lot about are the things we decide we need to consider and make decisions about. Newspaper readers see bigger contrast between candidates than TV viewers. And the reason would be is newspaper readers are reading and getting more information off the page. One of my exercises I've done is when I've had a transcript of a lecture. The lecture takes 30 minutes. And when I've had students read the lecture, it takes about 8 or 9 minutes to read. So you can read and gather a lot more information that way than by watching. TV news affects the popularity of presidents as well. Government in the news. Teddy Roosevelt was the first president who systematically cultivated the press. He had a press room set aside. FDR was had a press secretary and had press conferences. Everybody, all the presidents now have press secretaries with a large staff. Coverage of Congress has never been equal to the coverage of the president. There have been live cameras in the House since 1978, in the Senate since 1986, but they will not get the kind of coverage the president has because there are 435 of them and another 100 of them, right? So there's just no way that they're going to get the same kind of coverage.